In the dead of night, over wartime Britain, German bomber crews were suddenly flying blind, their instruments spinning wildly, their radio navigation systems screaming static, and their carefully plotted courses to London dissolving into chaos. They had no idea they were being attacked by a weapon that didn't fire a single bullet. The Nazis called it cowardly, a violation of the honorable rules of war, but this invisible shield would save tens of thousands of British lives and change the nature of warfare forever. The man behind it was a quiet physicist who understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that destroys, but the one that deceives. This is the story of how Britain fought back against the Luftwaffe, not with more planes or bigger guns, but with a radio trick so brilliant, so audacious, that it turned the night sky itself into a trap. September 1940, and London was burning. Night after night, wave after wave of German Heinkel and Dornier bombers droned across the English Channel, guided by a navigation system so precise it was almost supernatural. The Luftwaffe could find their targets in total darkness, in thick fog, in conditions where British night fighters were essentially flying blind. The Blitz was methodical, scientific, and utterly devastating. In the smoking ruins of the East End, in the shattered remains of Coventry Cathedral, the British were facing a terrifying reality. Germany had achieved technological superiority in the night sky, and Britain was losing. But in a nondescript building in the English countryside, a small team of scientists and engineers were about to turn the tables with nothing more than radio transmitters and an understanding of the enemy's own arrogance. The German navigation system was called Knickebein, which translates to crooked leg, and it was a masterpiece of engineering. The concept was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Two powerful radio beams were transmitted from stations in occupied Europe, each beam narrow and focused, like invisible searchlights cutting through the night. A German bomber crew would fly along one beam, listening to a steady tone in their headphones. And when they heard the second beam intersect the first, they knew with pinpoint accuracy that they were directly over their target. It was bombing by geometry, and it was supposed to be unjammable, undetectable, and unstoppable. The Luftwaffe was so confident in the system's security that they barely bothered to encrypt it. After all, the British didn't even know it existed. Except they did. In June 1940, a young scientist named Reginald Victor Jones was summoned to a meeting that would change his life and the course of the war. Jones was only 28 years old, a brilliant physicist who had been pulled from academic research to serve as the head of scientific intelligence for British air intelligence. He was a man who saw the world in frequencies, wavelengths, and mathematical probabilities. And he had just received a piece of intelligence that seemed almost too fantastic to believe. A downed German bomber had been recovered with unusual radio equipment, and interrogated Luftwaffe prisoners had made cryptic references to radio beams that could guide aircraft with impossible precision. Jones was handed a puzzle with missing pieces, conflicting reports, and a ticking clock. If the Germans really had developed such a system, and if it was already operational, then every night Britain delayed in responding was another night of unchallenged destruction. Jones assembled his team and began one of the most critical scientific investigations of the war. They pored over captured documents, analyzed prisoner statements, and most importantly, they listened. British radio monitoring stations were ordered to scan the airwaves for unusual transmissions, and within days they found them. Powerful directional radio beams operating on frequencies around 30 megahertz, precisely timed, precisely aimed, and active during every major Luftwaffe bombing raid. Jones plotted the beam origins on a map, and his blood ran cold. The beams intersected directly over British cities, factories, and ports. The Germans weren't just bombing by guesswork or visual landmarks. They were flying an invisible highway in the sky, and that highway led straight to the heart of Britain's industrial capacity. The discovery was brought to the highest levels of government. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself was briefed, and he immediately grasped the implications. If the Germans could bomb with this level of precision, then dispersing factories, hiding in the darkness, and relying on cloud cover would be useless. Britain's entire defensive strategy was based on the assumption that night provided protection, but the Luftwaffe had turned night into day. Churchill asked Jones a single question. "Can you stop it?" Jones, with the characteristic confidence of a man who understood the physics involved, replied that he could do better than stop it. He could turn it against them. The plan Jones proposed was audacious and required a level of technical sophistication that barely existed in 1940. Instead of trying to jam the German beams with brute force, which would simply alert the Luftwaffe that their system had been compromised, Jones wanted to deceive them. He would build British transmitters that would mimic the German navigation beams perfectly, broadcasting on the exact same frequencies with the exact same signal characteristics, but with one critical difference. The British beams would be slightly out of alignment, subtly shifted, just enough to lead German bombers away from their intended targets. The Germans would hear their navigation tones. They would follow their beams, and they would believe with absolute confidence that they were on course, but they would be flying into empty fields, into the ocean, into anywhere except where they intended to be. The system was codenamed Aspirin, and it was a race against time. Jones and his team had to reverse engineer the German system, build compatible transmitters, position them strategically across Britain, and calibrate them with absolute precision, all while the Blitz continued to pound British cities night after night. The technical challenges were immense. The British transmitters had to be powerful enough to override the genuine German beams, but not so powerful that they created obvious interference. They had to be synchronized perfectly, and they had to be operated by personnel who understood the delicate art of electronic deception. Jones recruited a team of radio engineers, many of them pulled from the BBC, and trained them in the dark art of what would later be called electronic warfare. By late 1940, the first Aspirin stations were operational, and the results were almost immediate. German bombing accuracy began to deteriorate mysteriously. Raids that were supposed to hit aircraft factories in Birmingham instead dropped their payloads on empty farmland miles away. A major attack intended for London's docks scattered bombs across the countryside. Luftwaffe crews returned to their bases confused and frustrated, insisting that they had followed their navigation beams precisely, yet their reconnaissance photos showed they had missed their targets by miles. The German High Command was baffled. At first, they blamed pilot error, then equipment malfunction, but as the pattern continued, a more disturbing possibility emerged. Someone was interfering with Knickebein. The Luftwaffe's response was to develop even more sophisticated navigation systems. They introduced X-Juret, a more complex beam system that used multiple frequencies and timed signals, and then Wotan, an even more advanced single-beam system that was supposed to be immune to jamming. But Reginald Victor Jones and his team were always one step ahead. Every time the Germans introduced a new system, British intelligence would detect it, analyze it, and within weeks, countermeasures would be deployed. The cat-and-mouse game escalated throughout 1941 and into 1942, a secret war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with radio waves and mathematics. The British developed an entire infrastructure of deception. They built fake cities, elaborate constructions of wood and canvas with lights that mimicked urban areas, and they used their mastery of German navigation systems to guide bombers toward these decoys. On more than one occasion, German crews bombed empty fields believing they were destroying vital industrial targets, and British intelligence would intercept their triumphant after-action reports claiming successful strikes. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. Bomber crews began to distrust their own instruments, second-guessing their navigation systems, and the confidence that had made the early Blitz so effective began to erode. Pilots who had once flown with absolute certainty now approached their targets with doubt, and doubt in aerial navigation is often fatal. But the true genius of Jones's strategy wasn't just the technical deception. It was the operational security surrounding it. The British went to extraordinary lengths to ensure the Germans never fully understood what was happening. When German bombers were shot down, British intelligence would carefully examine the wreckage and remove any evidence of jamming or interference. Captured Luftwaffe crew members were interrogated in ways that subtly reinforced the idea that their navigation failures were due to equipment problems or atmospheric conditions, never enemy action. The British even allowed some German raids to succeed, deliberately turning off their countermeasures for certain attacks to prevent the Luftwaffe from recognizing a pattern. It was a calculated sacrifice, trading some damage for the preservation of a strategic advantage that was saving far more lives in the long run. The impact of this invisible war was staggering. Post-war analysis estimated that British electronic countermeasures reduced German bombing accuracy by as much as 75% during critical periods of the Blitz. Thousands of tons of bombs that were intended for factories, ports, and residential areas instead fell harmlessly into fields and forests. The number of lives saved is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates place it in the tens of thousands. Yet the German High Command never fully grasped what was happening. Even after the war, many Luftwaffe officers insisted that their navigation systems had been fundamentally sound, and that their failures were due to British luck or atmospheric anomalies. The idea that they had been systematically deceived by a radio trick was too humiliating to accept. The Nazis, who prided themselves on technological superiority, had been outmaneuvered not by superior force, but by superior intellect. Reginald Victor Jones became one of the unsung architects of Allied victory. While fighter pilots and bomber crews received medals and public acclaim, Jones and his team worked in absolute secrecy. Their work was so classified that even decades after the war, many details remained hidden. Jones himself was forbidden from discussing his wartime activities for years, and when he finally published his memoirs in 1978, the book Most Secret War revealed for the first time the full scope of the electronic warfare campaign that had been waged in the shadows. The techniques pioneered by Jones and his team became the foundation of modern electronic warfare. Every jamming system, every radar countermeasure, every GPS spoofing technology used by militaries today can trace its lineage back to those desperate nights over Britain when a small group of scientists fought the Luftwaffe with nothing but radio transmitters and ingenuity. The story of Aspirin and the Battle of the Beams is a reminder that warfare is not just about firepower and courage. It's about intelligence, adaptation, and the willingness to fight unconventionally. The Germans called it cowardly because it violated their sense of honorable combat, but there is nothing honorable about bombing civilians, and there is everything honorable about using your mind to protect them. In the end, the Luftwaffe's technological advantage was turned into a fatal vulnerability. Their reliance on Knickebein and its successors became a weakness that British intelligence exploited ruthlessly. The very system that was supposed to make German bombers unstoppable became the mechanism of their failure. Today, if you visit the sites of the old British monitoring stations and transmitter locations, there's almost nothing left to see. The equipment was dismantled long ago, the buildings repurposed or demolished, and the men and women who operated them have mostly passed into history. But their legacy lives on in every piece of electronic warfare equipment, in every military doctrine that prioritizes intelligence over brute force, and in the survival of a nation that refused to surrender even when the night sky itself seemed to belong to the enemy. The quiet physicist who saw the war as a problem to be solved rather than a battle to be fought saved more lives than many generals, and he did it without firing a shot. So the next time you hear someone dismiss intelligence work as less important than frontline combat, remember the story of how Britain blinded the Nazi bombers with a radio trick, and remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the one your enemy never sees coming. If this story of invisible warfare and brilliant deception fascinated you, then you'll want to see what other secret weapons and untold strategies changed the course of history. So go ahead and hit that like button to help others discover these hidden chapters of the war, and subscribe because there are dozens more stories like this one. Tales of ingenuity and courage that deserve to be remembered, waiting to be told.